Oh yeah, as a critique of the iPod firmware, it gets even worse when you consider that Apple, created a lossless file format that was proprietary of their own, but it failed massively in that, when when you think about it, when you go, to file networks, do you ever see ALAX, really being passed around on torrent trackers and on SoulSeek? I don't think I've ever actually witnessed that go down on them at all. It hasn't transpired. But when you process that, it's almost as though it was just pure anger and rage and greed and everything that motivated Apple to leave the Apple firmware on the set on the state that it was, because they were just big mad that they were losing the format war over the new file format. It was just like they had created their own proprietary one, but the spirit of the internet is openness, and and Apple was striking against that spirit with their little walled garden approach, because that's just it completely antithetical to the original vision of the web. To have a walled garden in the first place. That's not what the people that designed it had in mind. They had open systems in mind, and you know uh, so the FLAC files were as opposed to you know LAC files or whatever. They those were the ones that were more widely distributed among people. The FLAC files, and it was because it was a free format that didn't owe royalties to anyone, and didn't ultimately it was completely open. The architecture wasn't proprietary by nature. This was open source and available to anybody that wanted to utilize it. It wasn't exclusionary in the way that Apple wanted it to be exclusionary in order to maximize profits. So they created this whole lossless file format, and but did they you know for one thing, I don't think that the iPod can even run Apple's proprietary lossless file format, but yet alone it's the FLAC files. And this is important to me, obviously, personally, because for one thing, I first I don't know if it was the first time I encountered it, but I noticed that the Nintendo Switch can support micro SD support on the damn thing, and that was really great and all, but that support was awesome, and everything, and but the thing about me is that, like, I'm a Civil Seek user, Orpheus member, outright professionalized music pirate. I go to concerts, leave me alone. It's not as if I'm a leech entirely. If I like your stuff enough, I show up. At your shows. So fuck off with that. Perception of me. For one thing, I just don't like paying for them, because I know that the artist doesn't get most of the compensation from the actual sale of albums and everything. So I'd rather just go to your show to be considered a contributing member of the fandom. I don't want to pay for the fucking album. I want to go and to your show and get a shirt or something when I'm there. Get merch, so that for one thing, because that more of that money ends up being directed towards the artists themselves, rather than to some third party that is there to extract as much of the revenue as they possibly can and steal it away from the person who actually produced the music. It's important to me that the musician get as much, the greatest share of the revenue, and that we cut out all middlemen, in that process. And that's why, for one thing. But no, I've been professionalized at ripping CDs with exact audio copy and everything, and I basically know what I'm doing. Because I've been at this since I was a child, and so it was important to me, because I'm a music pirate, and even still, I haven't dropped my childhood habits. I'm not going to change on that front. And because of that, and the nature of that, obviously, I prefer the Yonko DPX1. That's the nature of the beast. You pirate a lot of music. That's what you want to use with something like that. But no, when you look at it, we all were very enthusiastic about Apple and the iPod, and one of the reasons why it was so revolutionary at the time was because a lot of us were looking at it, and we were all really very excited because we could take our MP3s with us and everything back in the era, but file formats moved on. Apple released their own lossless format, and then they got big mad that the FLAC files ended up beating their proprietary format out and were far more widely adopted, and then they never updated the fucking iPod firmware at all to run either file format, at all in the whole thing. And, the iPods just fell basically out of date with the very purpose they were designed for in the first place. And, meanwhile, the only way to get that functionality back in was to Rockbox the device. But, of course, some users still preferred the stock firmware because they felt that, that Rockbox didn't produce as high of quality sound output out of the damn things. Meanwhile, the audiophiles were exploring all kinds of alternatives to the iPod, like the Dionco DPX1, the FiOS, and all these other ones with enthusiast grade, IEM or headphones and all this other stuff that they were looking at. And it depended on how much money you wanted to spend and everything. But there were enthusiast grade devices that were basically starting to emerge that solved all of the same issues that Apple originally solved with the iPod, which is to say that the early MP3 players sucked. Everybody, anybody that had them at the time knew that, and the iPod was just like they had second mover advantage in the market. They'd entered in such a way that they looked at what and I've never used this term before, so it's novel for me to point this out. But what Apple does a lot of the time is they let all the other players take their shot at implementing it, and then they come in and release a more elegant solution to the very problem that all the other providers have addressed. But Onco benefited from third person advantage when it came to entry into that market. Onco was able to see what Apple provided and upend them.